Hello, I'm Andrew Headland, and I'm going to be discussing Economy, Part C, from Thoreau's Walden. This passage fits into the totalness of Walden, in that this is when Thoreau is discussing the economy of actually owning a house, and whether it's good or bad, and what it means to actually own a house. And in this part, he builds his own house at the Walden Pond. Okay, so to begin the summary, in paragraph 1, Thoreau questions the necessity of shelter. He acknowledges that shelter is a human necessity required by life, but he wonders how much shelter is actually necessary. And toward the end of this paragraph, it's interesting because we notice that he calls Adam and Eve a fable, showing mild agnosticism, which can relate to the transcendentalism movement, because we're past the Great Awakening, and we're kind of into the Second Great Awakening, which Thoreau doesn't really follow. So it's characteristic of this time period that he would call Adam and Eve a fable. In paragraph 2, Thoreau discusses why we would want shelter. To summarize, he says, we yearn for the possession of having shelter, like we covet what thy neighbor has. And he relates to being a child, like as a child you would always want to go explore a cave or underneath a tree. This is because we want this shelter. We want to own and control this area of safety. He makes an interesting statement in saying that poets like himself don't exactly desire shelter. Much as the songbird does not sing in caves, the poet would have difficulty being poetic if he were cramped into some New England estate. I don't know how I feel about that. Paragraph 3, he asks, exactly how much of a shelter do we need? He asks about the savages. Are there teepees or wigwams good enough? With the teepees and wigwams, everyone has essentially the same amount of shelter, and everyone owns their shelter. It's a small enough space, but it's large enough to live in. Interesting. He also wonders about a 6-foot box that's 3 feet wide, and if you just poked air holes in it, would it be enough to live in? He ponders this briefly and gives it up. He decides that, or we find out later that he decides that a shack is probably what's best. In paragraph 4, he discusses actually owning a shelter, what it means to own where you live. He's comparing civilized society versus the savage society in this, with rented land against the wigwam. He's decided that rented land is not as good because you have to pay property tax, and this doesn't actually equate. It's more like renting your house when you have to pay a property tax. He says that this property tax leads to poverty and the government owning the shelter. In paragraph 5, he asks some life questions. He states that civilization is an institution, and inside this institution, the individual is absorbed and unimportant. And here we see another transcendentalist quality in which he is valuing the individual very highly. The community he doesn't really care about, but the individual is what he's focusing on. Paragraphs 6 and 7 are assorted Bible verses. Paragraph 8, he's discussing who actually owns land, and he says there's an elite few in America who actually own their land, who aren't savages, And paragraph 9, he states that the farmer traps himself by purchasing his house, and that the savages are richer because they actually own their land instead of having to pay property tax. Paragraph 10, he states that houses trap the individual because of this property tax. They owe the government money, and the individual focuses more on actually owning their land than improving their lifestyle and doing anything really about owning their own land. In paragraph 11, Thoreau admits that, yes, most people can rent their house and do all right in life, but he questions whether the civilized man should have better living conditions than a savage, because the pursuits of a civilized man are truly no greater than that of a savage. I think he even intends to imply that the savage's pursuits in life are greater, because the savage focuses on connecting with nature and spirituality, which again is a very transcendentalist thing to do. Paragraph 12, Thoreau is discussing the degraded poor and how they're everywhere, living on the outsides of cities and in farms. He actually shows southern sympathy here by admitting that those living in the South are too severely graded and in too high of numbers to consider here, because he's talking about the moderately degraded. Paragraph 13. He's discussing why poor people are poor. And he says that the poor people maintain the wrong values. Not necessarily that they're sinful by any means, but that they value appearance. He goes on and discusses that Arabs and Indians have simple furniture while ours is decorative, saying that we value this luxury of appearance, but it really does nothing. And he goes back again to saying, we covet what our neighbors have. This sense of morality and more about experiencing the spirituality and morality of life is more important than materialism. Again, very transcendental and romantic. Paragraph 14, Thoreau speaks of true comfort. He states that true comfort is not luxury or having nice things, it's having space to himself. He says that he'd rather ride an ox cart all the way across the country as long as he can be by himself than to pack into a commercial train to go somewhere, because he'd be too close to people. Paragraph 15, he criticizes art and luxury of the times and says that humans have become immoral and value luxury too highly. Paragraph 16, he discusses the morality of other cultures' housing. His main point is the Dutch. The Dutch, when they get new land to farm on, they work first for 3 or 4 years living in this hole that they've dug into the ground. It's this basic shelter that has a hole just large enough to hold their families, and they line it with bark. Now, the ground gives them warmth, and then they just cover their hole with sticks and stuff to prevent rain from coming in. He states that houses should be purchased or built when they can be afforded, not when you decide to go somewhere. Paragraph 17, he states that humans should be more spiritual and love nature, and he makes it's a very outside-the-box statement, and he says that the most beautiful thing he could think of is a house lined with seashells instead of wood, because the seashells would help him experience the beauty of nature. Paragraph 18, he summarizes what he's discussed in paragraphs 1 through 17. Basically, wigwams and caves are better and have more advantages than houses do. Paragraph 19. Walden begins... Thoreau begins his Walden experiment. He goes to Walden Pond, begins to cut down trees for timber, and he starts to build his house with this timber. The description in this paragraph, it's a very long paragraph, it shows that he loves nature a lot. He's really into it. And he talks a lot about the spirit of this nature, which is very romantic, very descriptive, and transcendental. Paragraph 20, he continues to cut trees, and he discusses befriending the trees, and that he means he knows more about the trees. He knows the trees better than he had before. This reminds me of Santiago and Old Man in the Sea, because Santiago is friends with and loves all the fish because he knows them and respects them more because he's around them all the time. In paragraph 20, Thoreau is enjoying himself quite severely. Paragraph 21, he buys the Collins shanty for a little more than $4. He likes this shanty, he admires it, but he disassembles it so that he can have the boards the shanty is built with. Paragraph 22, he begins moving the boards, and he's enjoying himself out in nature. Paragraph 23, he begins to build his cellar. He digs into the dirt and sand and walls it with wood, like he said the Dutch do. Paragraph 24, his house is raised. He's living very simply. He grows his own food, and he builds his chimney in the fall. Before this, he was cooking his food outside over a fire. This work is very much reflective of the Romantic movement, and specifically Transcendentalism, because of the value of the individual and the love and connection with the spirit of nature and the morality of the simple. To reiterate, this passage is Thoreau discussing the morality and economy of purchasing homes and shelter, and he begins to build his own shelter, and eventually it is raised.